So this is going to be a very basic ZBrush tutorial for people who may be using ZBrush for the very first time or are just starting to get into it. And the purpose is to kind of show you a basic workflow for modeling sculpting objects. So once you launch ZBrush, usually you'll see this light box open up with a lot of preset objects that you can double click on to create. If you don't see it, you can always click on the light box button over there on the upper left to show or hide it. So in today's lesson, we're going to start with Dynamesh 16. We'll just double click on that and create a Dynamesh sphere. That gives us a nice sphere, and you can see there are some options for increasing the brush size up on top. You can drag that slider, or you can press the S key and drag using your left mouse button to make the draw size larger or smaller. On the lower right hand side, you can see move, scale, and rotate. Hold down the left mouse button and drag left and right across those buttons to move your shape around and to rotate it, and scale it, bringing it closer or further away. And you can hit the frame button on top just to kind of have your model fill the view. Now under transform, you'll see we have activate symmetry on, which is great for when you're making something that is the same on both sides. So let's say like a face. So you can sculpt one side of the face while you have symmetry on, and it's in the x-axis that it's mirroring. So you can see there's a cursor on both sides because I have symmetry on. If I go in, and I have the standard brush on right now, I'll bring it closer with scaling it, and I start sculpting using the standard brush. And you'll see that both sides are affected at the same time. I can rotate it around to look at it from different angles. I can hold down the shift button and it gives me my smooth brush. You can see how that changed in the upper left corner. Now I can smooth down the shape. I can also change the intensity of that smoothing by adjusting that Z intensity slider up there. And I can work with all these different brushes that you see in here. Now I'm only going over a few of them in this lesson that I use the most. So clay buildup, for example, is a really good one, and it does exactly what it sounds like. When you click on your model with that brush, it's as if you're adding more clay to your sculpt. Then you can smooth that out with using shift and the smooth brush at any time. So using those shortcut keys really kind of speeds up your workflow. And in addition to that, I really like using the move brush. So if I'm looking for a brush, I'll type in the first letter of the name of that brush, and it helps me narrow down the brushes. It makes it easier to select. So with the move brush, I'm able to simply move points around. And as you're sculpting, it's really good to keep rotating your object around to really see the shapes that you're creating from all angles, just like you would if you were sculpting something out of clay. Now I can see the polylines on here, so I want to see like the actual vertices and polygons of this object. Now pretty soon you'll understand why I'm using Dynamesh for this. So as I push and pull these shapes, you can see that the polygons get very stretched. So after a point, it gets really hard to add additional details because there's so few points to work with. This is where Dynamesh comes in really handy. I can simply hold down some control and left mouse button to drag in an empty part of the view. And because this is a Dynamesh, it'll actually regenerate this model with a more uniform distribution of like these polygons and these vertices, these points and rectangles on here. And so then I can more easily sculpt in more detail as I change the shape of this object. I can do some sculpting. And at any time, I can regenerate that surface using the left mouse button and dragging some control and left mouse button to drag in an empty part of the view. So it's very easy. So if I click on geometry on the right hand side, I can go into where it says Dynamesh and click on that. And we have additional options. The main one that I'll go over right now is just resolution. At the moment, you can see it's set to 16. So let's say I click on that number and change it to 32, type in 32 or drag that orange slider. And again, Control key plus the left mouse button, and you can see that there are more polygons now. So that gives me more vertices to shape with. Now I don't want to get too detailed at this stage using Dynamesh. I would rather just get my basic shapes this way. That way I don't have these stretched out polygons in areas. It's really nice to be able to regenerate that. But if you get too detailed with Dynamesh, you can set the resolution pretty high and sculpt a lot, but it tends to get very messy. So Dynamesh to me is perfect for getting your basic shapes. Once you get that, go to ZRemesher. You have different options. You can make it half the resolution, meaning half the number of points or vertices, double the number, but we'll just leave it on Adapt. Click on ZRemesher, and it will create kind of a normal polygon object. It's not a Dynamesh anymore. It's just regular polygons with a fairly even distribution of vertices. But now this is perfect for adding in higher levels of detail. So I can divide. Each time I divide, it increases the number of vertices, meaning the amount of the detail that I can put in. Now I can go down to like the first subdivision level, the lowest detail level, and sculpt on there, get some nice broad shapes in there, and then go to higher levels like subdivision 2 and add finer details. It's a really cool way of being able to work on large, more broad sorts of changes at the lower subdivision levels, and then work in some finer details in the higher subdivision levels. So here I'm using the Alt key. I'm holding down the Alt key and sculpting with the standard brush to dig into the model instead of pulling the sort of clay outwards and pushing inwards. And then just softening it up using the smooth brush by pressing Shift. And I can increase my subdivisions by clicking on divide at any time to add more detail. Now, I would advise that you increase the subdivisions as needed. Just sculpt in at subdivision 2, and once you feel like you need more detail in order to get the additional kind of features you want to sculpt in, that's when you should increase your subdivision level and then sculpt at that new level until you feel like you've hit the limit and need kind of more vertices to work with, more polygons to work with. But you have to be careful. You don't want to subdivide your model too much, otherwise it can become too heavy to work with. Although ZBrush is pretty impressive, you can go pretty high on it and still be able to work with it. But anyway, you get, I think, the basic idea of how using the Alt key to push in to get those nostrils. And now I'm at subdivision 3, and I'm trying to smooth out that sharp point at the tip of the nose. So sometimes at higher subdivision levels it can be harder to do that. There are more sort of vertices, more polygons that you're trying to smooth. And so it can be easier to make those more broader changes by lowering the subdivision level, softening it up the way you want, or making whatever changes you want, and then increase the subdivision level. And you'll see that those changes actually propagated up to from subdivision 1 to subdivision 3. So it's a really dynamic and interesting way of working. So being able to have a lower resolution representation of your model is extremely useful later on for things such as rigging, if you want to animate your object using bones and things like that, or even there are different ways that you can add that detail from the higher subdivision levels onto that lower resolution object, which will make it render faster. You can use displacement maps based on the higher level subdivisions to get that detail back on the lower subdivision levels in your 3D animation program. You can also use normal maps. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this lesson, but just to give you an idea, like put some of those words in your head if you haven't heard them before. Those could be later concepts and things that I go over in future lessons if people are interested. That gives you a basic idea of working with Dynamesh and sculpting objects in ZBrush. You can see how it's so much easier to create really interesting sculpted forms using ZBrush as compared to modeling in Maya or 3D Studio Max.